Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Slow Art Friday. My name is Christy McMillan, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Asheville Art Museum. I'm joined by Doris Potash, one of our master docents, who will be leading today's conversation. Each Friday at 12 p.m. while the museum is closed, docents lead virtual, interactive conversations about a few artworks in our collection or special exhibitions. The goal is simple: slow down, discover the joy of looking at art, and talk about the experience with others. For today's program, Doris will lead us in an interactive conversation about 3 artworks in our collection. We'll spend about 15 minutes or so with each artwork. Doris will allow us time to look at each work on our own, slowly, before leading a conversation about each one with questions. As participants, we encourage you to engage in dialogue with Doris, myself, and each other throughout the hour. Just a few notes before we get started. You notice when you logged in that your microphones and video were muted by default. If you'd like to turn on your video at any time, we'd welcome to see your smiling face. And there will be a moment here in the very near future where I will allow you to turn on your microphone as well. Some tips for best experience: choose a quiet room and close the door. We ask that you please silence any alerts from nearby devices. If you do choose to have your video on, try not to sit in front of a window, lamp, or other strong light source, as it makes it hard for us to see you. Use headphones and microphone for best sound quality. While you can log in using your smartphone, we do recommend using a desktop, laptop, or tablet to see slides and meeting tools on a larger screen. So that we know who we're having a conversation with today, please make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last initial, or first name and last name. To ask questions or make comments throughout the program, you'll be able to unmute your microphone when Doris or I ask for questions or comments, and you see why all of these alerts are going off all around me. You can also type questions or comments into the chat box, and Doris and I will keep an eye over there to be able to incorporate those into the conversation as well. A third way to participate is to raise your hand in the participant sidebar. Either Doris or I will call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone to make your comment. Just as a note, these can be very fast-moving conversations, so raising your hand in the participant sidebar and being asked to be called on can sometimes take a while. So we do encourage you to just jump in with your questions and comments. Finally, we are recording. If you prefer not to be recorded, please make sure that your video and audio remain muted and use the chat box to submit any questions or comments that you might have. At this point, I'm going to make it so that folks can unmute yourself at will. Please do leave your microphone turned off unless you're actively asking a question or making a comment. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions before we get started? All right, Doris, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy that we have so many people joining us on such a hot and muggy Friday afternoon here in Asheville. We're going to be talking about art during the Depression, and the 3 artworks that we'll be talking about today are all prints. And one of the reasons that I chose prints was because I know when we're walking through the museum, particularly the Asheville Art Museum, there are so many really large, colorful paintings and sculptures and other works of art that we often walk right by some of the smaller prints, particularly those that aren't colored. And so once I learned about some of these prints, they suddenly became my favorite. They're things that I typically walk by, never looked at, and now I just keep going back to them because they're so interesting. So I hope I'm going to inspire some of you to take a closer look at these prints when the museum reopens, and also others that we have in our collection. Just by way of introduction in terms of the artworks, during the Great Depression, which was from 1929 roughly to 1939, many artists found employment through the Federal Arts Project, which was a Roosevelt program as part of the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which you've probably heard of. And I was really surprised. I didn't realize how many artists actually participated in the Federal Art Project. From 33 to 42, I read the number that there were as many as 10,000 artists who worked in various art media in this program. And the idea was to both capture the hardship that Americans were going through during the Depression, but also a vision of a better America for that time. So keep those kind of objectives in mind as we look at the artwork. So Christy, can you show us our first one? And I always say, I know I say this every time if you've joined me before, that I always say, this is one of my favorite things in the museum. So I think everything in the museum is probably my favorite, but this is one of my favorite prints. So take a few seconds and look at it. Think about, I'm going to talk about what's going on here. There's a lot going on. Anybody ready to jump in? What's going on?
Well, I see a carousel. It definitely comes out to be a carousel with a number of horses, and I see the expressions on the horses' faces to be very interesting, where they look like they're yelling in some way. And so I see that.
Okay, so to start with, a carousel, and horses on the carousel, and you particularly notice the expression on the horses' faces, and it said that you looked like they were yelling. What is it about the expression that makes them look like they're yelling?
I think the way their mouths are open so wide. And looking at the people's faces, what you said before about hardship versus looking for a better America, the girl in the forefront there with the shoes and her legs crossed and her hand is facing up looks calmer, or maybe looking for a better America, where the gentleman with the cigarette or cigar out of his mouth looks quite intent.
Okay, so any other thoughts from other people about the expressions on their faces? Someone's, looking forward, perhaps the woman, the man's expression is kind of intense. What other things what other interpretations of the expressions would you have?
I think of a carousel as being something that should be fun and pleasurable, and not one expression looks fun or pleasurable. Everyone looks frightened. The horses look frightened. The people look frightened or quizzical. It's not a, there's not a lot of fun or frivolity taking place.
So not just from both the animals, the horse figures, the people figures, no one looks like they're really having a lot of fun.
It's a very chaotic looking scene.
What is it that makes it chaotic looking? What did the artists do to create that sense of chaos?
A lot of diagonal lines.
Diagonal lines for sure creates that sense of movement and chaos.
Doris, to me, it reminds me, there was a Jack Brel song called Carousel, and it gets faster and louder and wilder. And it reminds me of that. There seems like it's supposed to be something that's fun, but somehow it's something a little off kilter about it. It's not fun.
Yeah. So maybe we can almost hear that song playing in the background, speeding up and speeding up and speeding
faster
up.
And faster, yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of comments in the chat box. Let's see if I can catch them all. The woman in the foreground has her hand thrown in the air. She appears perplexed, maybe hopeless. It looks like a devil in the background on the right. Can you all see that? I can't point to it because I don't have control. Oh, Christy is here. She has control of the screen. Can you see that face? It's sort of like gargoyle kind of sculpture there in the background, or painting in the backdrop. The face, here we go, another interesting comment. This is Allegra, and she says it resonates with me in face of the pandemic. Those look forward with anxiety. The woman looking out past the viewer seems to have somewhat helpless look on her face. Uncertainty is the theme then and now. So kind of relating it to things that are going on with us today. What do you
The other
think?
thing
Wasn't this the
Doris,
Depression time? Was this
Oh.
the time of the Depression?
Yes, this was 1930. This print was created in 1930. So it is just the beginning of the Depression. If you look at the 29 crash as being kind of the start of the Depression.
the horse on the left is out of sequence with the other horses. And if you think about how a carousel works, look at how all of the other horses are somewhat lined up and looking the same way. The one on the far left is coming at us. It's coming at the viewer. Its eyes are fierce. Its mouth is not as open. Its eyes are fierce. And it really is a frightening, to me, looks like a frightening image coming at me, rather than the rest of them who seem to be going around.
Yeah, and Martha points out on the chat that that's the only figure that seems to be looking right at us, which
Right.
I would imagine contributes to that sort of sense of ferocity.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit more about the man in the figure. Someone said that originally that he looked intense.
Well, he has that cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He looks frightening. He looks aggressive.
So just his facial expression it appears to be aggressive.
Mm-hmm. And his body. He's leaning.
And his body.
I
Leaning
think
forward.
he looks more sinister.
Sinister.
Sinister. It's like he seems to be having bad motives, and it seems like he might be leering at that woman next to him. Got her eyes closed.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. He seems to be kind of looking at her and leering at her. He does seem like kind of a creepy character.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that, again, the horse on the left, it looks like there's maybe pictures of heads in some kind of like a metal or pin or four-leaf clover. And one of them's obscured on the left, but there look like two heads there. I'm not sure of the significance of that, but it's
almost kind of skull-like in a way.
Right.
In that, whatever that decoration is, I don't know. I'm sure there's some official name for it, but like you see in a circus or something, there's carvings there on that decoration on that horse. So, you know, as someone said before, it doesn't seem to be like a really maybe happy scene at all.
I'm wondering why the woman is sitting side saddle and I can see so far up her skirt.
So what does this say about how women are depicted in this scene, if anything? What do you think?
Well, the leering man, the woman on the right looks worried, and the man, even though he's not on the same horse, it looks as if he has designs on her in an evil fashion. I think it just seems like women.
I'd be curious why people think the man is so leering. The only thing that implies that is the cigarette.
Oh, I find his expression, and notice he's depicted in a darker manner than the woman is, so that there's the contrast between light and dark.
So that sense of sinisterness, whether it's leering or not, it could be also created by the kind of shadowing that the artist put on him, the direction that he's looking, the cigarette, his mouth expression, his body being kind of tilted forward toward perhaps toward the female character in front of him. Someone else talked about the fact that there aren't any children on this carousel, and that's what we would typically expect to see, at least these days, on a carousel. You wouldn't think of adults on a carousel. Micah Jean says that this male figure could be in a panic if this is about the Depression. So it could be a panic expression. Christy says it's like film noir, that shadow around him. I think his hat too, reminds me of what you would see in film noir. What do you think the artist is trying to tell us about women in this, if anything? Do you think he, has a particular feeling about women versus the male character? Do you think in terms of the way they're portrayed?
Well, someone in the chat box had mentioned that it's the dress of the day, and I'm in the middle of digitizing some family home movies from the 50s, a little later than that. But I noticed all the women wore dresses.
Yeah.
And so I think it was Edward who mentioned that it's the dress of the day, and it's true, women wore dresses then. Perhaps it's a bit of a feminist, not feminist, but female stereotyping in those days with the legs. But I generally get that chaos from this, and it's a carousel should be vertical, up and down and going around, and this is not doing any of that. So it is chaotic and frightening.
Yeah, and Gail says to that point that when you think of a carousel, that you never really you're constantly moving, but you're never catching up to the person in front of you, which I think is an interesting observation as well.
That's true.
It says, the man strikes me as trying to pass the women on his horse, and the tension in his hands and shoulders seems to propel him forward. Interesting observation there too.
He almost looks like a jockey. I mean, the women look more casual. The woman in the front is side saddle. The other woman has her foot almost in the stirrup, kind of holding on, but her body is back away. Where this gentleman, he's like almost like he's like riding this horse like a jockey, like he wants to cross the finish line.
Yeah. Barbara?
I think the young lady in the front, she seems, even though her skirt is very short, there's something very more innocent about her than the other woman that's on the other side. And she seems to be waving like a sad farewell, like it's, like the way her arm is raised. I know when I was a little girl, I went on that merry-go-round, you waved to your parents, but it looks almost like a very sad farewell. Maybe she's forced to leave the farm and go to the big city during the Depression. There's something very forlorn about her look.
Yeah. Notice that she is, other than that horse in the foreground that you pointed out being, certainly very large, but notice that she's kind of the central human figure here, and she's portrayed very, is very large, right in the middle. Does she look strong to you?
She looks vulnerable to me.
What is it that makes her look vulnerable, Barbara?
I think it's just the expression on her face. I just get this very forlorn look, and she's not happy. She seems to be waving, which would be a gesture of some kind of joy, but her expression just seems to me to portray some kind of loss or anxiety. She's not happy to be where she's at.
Yeah. So both the gesture and the face, whoops, Christy, I think we lost something.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Better?
Yes. That's okay. I've gotten cut off a couple of times. So when my Wi-Fi goes out, so my fingers are crossed. You just can't see that.
Computers. We're just doing the best we can.
I know. So she seems to be okay. There's a chat here. She seems to be looking at someone past the carousel, as if saying, "Get me off of here," which I think that's another interesting observation. Just does this place, does this give you a sense of place at all in terms of a geographic location? Does it seem to be typically something that it might remind you of a place that maybe you've been?
It could be any place.
Not really.
I think of New York. I don't know why. Perhaps the black and white and the illustration. And there is a carousel in Central Park, I believe. So I don't know why, but I think of New York.
Yeah. That's what it kind of reminded me. And I guess maybe when I think of the Depression, I usually think of photographs and things that do depict New York. And so I guess I just automatically came to the conclusion that this was from New York. This artist is Reginald Marsh. And he was born in Paris, although his parents were American. They're both artists. And he moved to New Jersey when he was 2 years old, so he grew up in the United States. He took classes at the Art Students League. He also went to Europe to study the old masters, which maybe some of this kind of reminds me of that. Some of the detail in this kind of reminds me of these old Italian paintings or something. He was obsessed with the American woman as a sensual and powerful figure. And in the 1930s, a lot of the women who lost their jobs then were exploited sexually, and he was very interested and concerned about this as well, and depicted this a lot in a lot of his art. He loved New York City, and usually what was then considered sort of the seamier sides of New York City, like the Bowery, and this perhaps was Coney Island, although as you mentioned, Kathy, it could very well have been the Central Park. I didn't think of that, Carousel. But this is very typical of the types of subject matter that he portrayed. And let's see, I do have a quote from him. He says, "Well-bred people are no fun to paint." So he kind of liked these sort of characters that he found on the street. All right, so next, something very different, but again, a Depression era print. So take a couple seconds to look at it. What's going on here?
Flood. I think it's a flood.
Flood?
And they're on top of their house, perhaps praying. The man seems to be in a pose of asking for something.
Okay, so we see a family on top of their house during a flood. One of the chat comments was it reminds him of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
The male figure looks like he might be praying, you said, because of the position of his hands.
The man is the only one that has shoes on. Everyone else is barefooted. And it just looks like he's, reaching up to the heavens and crying out for help, to save him and his family, his home. There's clearly an animal, but it looks strange because it doesn't look like a dog or a cat, yet you'd assume it's a pet of some sort. So
yeah, you can see that on the left. Christy pointed it out, and yeah, I thought it was a cat, but I'm not really sure. It looked just because maybe I have a black cat and that kind of looks like a cat to me, so I automatically think of cats. So someone pointed out that this possibly could be the Great Flood in Mississippi in 1927. And this print was created in 1934, so very well could have been. And we'll talk a little bit about the artist at the end.
There are no other houses around, so it may have been a farmer. If it was a more populous, area, I would expect to see other rooftops, other people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. They seem to be kind of isolated there. So whether that is because it was just a farm and they're kind of out in the middle of nowhere, or whether other things have gotten washed away, it's kind of a mystery there.
Yeah, he looks like he has overalls on.
He looks like he has overalls, and someone else had mentioned that he's the only figure with shoes, which I never noticed before. So probably a farmer.
Is a very big range of expression. The father looks like he's praying. the children are clinging. The mother looks so distraught. She has her head down and her eyes closed, and very, there's a lot of differences in their expressions.
Yeah, so we have the father who looks like he's praying, the children clinging to the people, to each other, and the mother kind of looking down with that sort of desperate expression on her face.
I think it's raining. It looks sort of like that, and that one boy looks like his clothes are really drenched.
Yeah, particularly that the boy in the center that you see his back, you can see the shape of his form through his clothes. That does give you, I think, also the impression that he's wet. A comment, Allegra says, his praying evokes the flood in Noah's Ark from the Bible, too. Is there something, Kathy, you mentioned that it looks like it's actually raining. Was there anything else other than the clothing of that boy looking wet? Is there anything that the artist did that creates that sense of rain coming down for you?
Yeah, the strokes in the sky seem to be vertical, whereas the strokes by on the base of the water are by and large horizontal.
Yeah. So the way that the artist created those lines it could give you that sense that it's raining. Someone else, like chats keep popping off, and pop that back on again, said the mark making in this lithograph is very somber. It's different from the energetic marks in the previous print. So you can see just how the artists use their skills to and techniques to create these different moods in these artworks. How does the theme of man? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The tree almost in the background is almost parallel to what they're doing. In a way, it looks just as desperate and reaching up.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation too. It kind of echoes the forms of the figures as they go up, sort of in a diagonal.
The tree looks like it's been blown down or pulled down, but yeah, it really doesn't make sense that the branches are still going upward, unless there's other branches under the water that are heavier than those, perhaps.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought about that before, but it could be that the tree was blown down and these were branches, so that the bottom could be the trunk of the tree, and these are branches that are kind of sticking up with the tree, kind of laying on its side. It could be. It looks, someone pointed out, Gail pointed out, that the children are very young. The family looks very young, with the oldest child maybe 5, and also Gail thinks the tree is floating by, which is what you said. And they were talking about the Johnstown flood, Barbara says, in 1936, where 2,000 people died. That was in Pennsylvania. So we all have, at least some pictures of floods in our mind. Has any of you ever been in a flood like this? Any experience that?
I've been in floods, not quite this bad. Just my hometown went through a flood, and a lot of homes took on several feet of water, and had to sandbag homes, and eventually the river in my hometown just went over, and over the sandbags, and just took out a large section of the area around within the floodplain.
Yeah, so very, very frightening experience, and really tragic for the victims. I can't imagine what it must be like. I've never been in a flood personally like this, where the water came up that high. I've been in flooded streets where cars have been rolling down the road, which was scary enough, but never anything like this. Hope I never do. How does the theme of man versus nature relate to what might be happening during the Great Depression? Because this was a Depression era print.
Wasn't there around the same time as Grapes of Wrath as the Dust Bowl and
The Dust Bowl, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that compounded the misery of the financial depression was really compounded by the nature, by the floods and by the Dust Bowl, and that made it so much worse.
Yeah, so a lot of natural disasters happening during that period that compounded it or perhaps contributed to what was happening. Gail also says the people who had very little to begin with now have lost everything.
Yeah, they're
kind of
completely helpless. They are, to me, just pitched on top of this roof with no way to save themselves.
Yeah, as Edward had said, Billy, there's nothing around at all. And you would think, when I think about floodwaters rising, I always think about people coming around in boats to, help people, help their neighbors off of their roofs and things like that. But, Edward pointed out the sort of desolation all around the house, no boat in sight, no savior coming for them.
I'll point out one more thing with the roof. You see where part of the roof is broken away. What I would envision is that they probably had to bust, like the water came up so high, they couldn't leave the home to go to the roof. So they actually had to bust through the roof from the inside of the house and then crawl out to get onto the roof.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot about that happening in New Orleans where, people, and at times people didn't have any tools or anything to push through the roof and were killed in their own attics because they couldn't even get out to the roof.
Yeah.
I was noticing the water looks as if it's still very forceful, very fierce, that the water is quite moving there. And below it, I can read the words. It actually looks to me as if it says Mississippi Noah.
That is the title of this print, Mississippi Noah.
Okay.
And so someone had mentioned Noah's Ark early on.
Right.
And that also gives you a clue that this is probably possibly inspired by the Great Mississippi Flood that someone mentioned earlier in 1927.
Is it just the way I'm seeing this, or does there appear to be a light source on the horizon? Does that?
So you pointed out that, and Christy's using her arrow to illustrate that there is some light coming from the center toward the right of this print. So what do you think this is? Do you think there's any hope for this family?
I don't want to give up hope for them. I hope somebody comes and finds them, but it doesn't look very promising. But I don't want to give up hope, but it does look very scary.
It looks like a scary situation. Maybe not any evidence, at least in the drawing of any, or in the print of any savior coming, a boat or something to hold on to. Anyone else have a different thought about whether this, about what might happen next? Is there?
Well, there is a light on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that they climbed on the roof in the dark, and it's beginning to be dawn, and that could be thought of as somewhat hopeful.
Yeah, so the light might just represent some type of hope. There's a dawn. There might be an end to the rain coming down, at least, and perhaps a reduction in the flood waters. Where are the children looking?
Mostly at the father.
Mm-hmm.
And
so, what do you think is going to
looking toward the mother, of course?
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think the children are thinking right now as they look to their father?
We're thinking, get us out of this.
Get us out of this.
Yeah.
But maybe thinking, I mean, when you think about when you were little like that, you know, that you probably thought your dad could get you out of anything, you know, right? So maybe they have hope, even though they might be frightened, but looking to their father for protection. Perhaps.
Maybe he asked them to pray with him.
Could be, yeah.
It looks like only one blanket. The child by the mother has a blanket, but there's no other evidence of blankets or toys or anything. And
Yeah, yeah.
I think the hat on the mother's head is interesting also, because it looks like the child's reaching up there with the hand and her hat. I don't know what that.
Yeah, it looks like it might be some kind of like a bandana, like that's kind of tied in the back, like you see women who work in the fields or something that often wear, or men too, I guess. That's what it looks like to me anyway. Yeah, and that baby's grabbing on to the mother's grabbing on to the baby.
And Doris, it's an interesting selection that you've made here, because what I think is, you know, with COVID times and everything that we hear, I mean, both in our personal lives and with our family and friends, is that even without a flood or this kind of a situation, one can feel very desperate and out of control, and like there's not a life raft. I think there are people going through that.
For sure.
Today.
Yeah. Yeah, and perhaps also, you know, during the Depression, just thinking about the feeling like you're, like as you were saying, caught up in something that you can't control, with the economic turmoil, as well as the physical, the natural turmoil here that they're going to. Looking up the history of the somebody's doing some looking up while we're looking at this, looking at the history of the Mississippi flood in 1927. The African American population was forced to work trying to prop up the levees. One man was shot for refusing to work. Oh my goodness. And they were left for days with no food. I also heard that in that flood, it was the most destructive river flood in the United States. More than 200,000 African Americans were displaced during that flood. Micah says 700,000 left homeless, 500 died. So it was a really, really horrible disaster at that time. And honestly, until I started researching this drawing, I really didn't know about that. So, or don't remember it if I did hear about it as a student. Yeah, pretty tragic times. And okay, here's in both works that we looked at, so the carousel and this work, people seem to be trapped in movement, whether on the carousel or in the current, out of their control. Very interesting comparison of the two artworks. I can tell you a little bit about the artist. He's John Steuart Curry. He was born in Kansas on a farm, and so as a result of where he was located geographically throughout his life, he witnessed a lot of natural disasters and had that feeling of that awesome power of disaster. His family was also very religious, so I think both of those things, that fascination with disaster and concern about disaster, as well as the religious nature, the hope, the prayer, and certainly the title would you know, certainly come through from that religious background. So he often depicted families who were victims of natural disasters in his art, and also you know, compared that to when he was an artist during the Depression, to what was going on in the economy, the economic disasters, as well as the natural disasters and the loss of job opportunity, loss of income that plunged people into this flood of disaster. All right, next. I'll take a look at this one. There's a lot of detail in this one too. All right, what's going on here? What do you notice?
It looks surrealistic.
Surrealistic. What makes it look surrealistic to you?
Well, the man diving into the sugar bowl and the octopus in the vinegar jar and the mushrooms growing in the salt and pepper shaker. It just has, and then there's almost like a mountain scene in the other, the salt or pepper shaker. There's just something that makes me have a surrealistic feeling to it.
Yeah, Micah says playful also.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in surrealism, they kind of juxtapose things that you wouldn't expect to see together, so that it does kind of gives it a sense of playfulness or sort of, confusion.
Or dreamlike.
Dreamlike.
I noticed the cigarette on the side of the coffee cup there.
Yeah, can everyone see that on the left in the center?
And how on the top left and then lower middle on the right where those tables are cut off, I'm assuming intentionally by the artist, you can see what looks to be like some sort of other tables that are not complete in the picture.
Okay, so you can see in the very top left, I'm not sure if you can see where I'm pointing. Christy said there's a fire alarm in her building. She has to leave.
Oh, no.
So, but fortunately, she left her computer on. So we can see there's a table into at the part of a table and chair that you can see in the very upper left, and then another part of a table in the maybe top third on the right there. And let me see there's some chats coming through. Allegra says that she loves the way the artist creates the brushed aluminum top. So notice that skill of making that, of creating that sense that you can see that reflection in that top. Someone else pointed out, Gail points out that the flower is very different above the vase than inside it. And there's another figure in the vase. Can everyone see that? Yeah. See it at the bottom of look at the bottom of the vase right where the part of the vase that holds the flower kind of curves into that pedestal part of the vase. Can you see the little person there?
It looks like the person's curled up or crouching down, holding onto the flower maybe.
Holding onto the flower stem.
Even though it's sort of absent, you can tell what everything's supposed to be. I mean, salt and pepper, oil and vinegar, sugar, a vase. So you can tell what these things are on this table, yet they've got all of these little interesting aspects to them on the insides and outsides.
Yeah. Any sense that gives you a sense of the time? Again, we know that this was done during the Depression. Is there anything that clearly says 1930s to you? Is it, kind of a place that reminds you of a place that you might have been? Not that any of us were around in the 1930s, but.
It sort of talks about both the Depression and then the looming Second World War that's coming. It's a really crazy world, and the guy's trying to hide in the sugar and all these other things. And so it's topsy-turvy in a sense, in terms of much like the other two pictures, but with a much more sense of humor.
Yeah, so in some ways you could interpret this as having a little bit of darkness, even though it is kind of whimsical at first, but it could be kind of foreboding. It could be reflecting, as you said, the economic turmoil that was going on at the time in the Depression, but also maybe a little bit foreboding about reflecting things going on in Europe at the time, right before World War II. Got some things going on in the chat box that I think are kind of interesting. Gail says it looks like that flower, that central flower, is the stalk of the flower isn't in the vase. It appears to be behind the vase, and it does sort of have that look. It's but And let's see, there were some other chats too here. In terms of my question about the time period that it might have been done, that the sugar container, specifically someone says, does look a bit Art Deco. That decoration around the rim perhaps does have that Art Deco sense. Allegra says it could be the Horn and Hardheart automats also. And you can tell that you can actually see the title of this at the bottom of the artwork where the artist has included it. It's called A Cafeteria Still Life, so could very well be that. Kathy says it almost, the tabletop looks like it might have a Lazy Susan on it. Kathy, what makes you, what gives you that sense of Lazy Susan?
Well, the two different levels, where the table where the coffee is, and then all the condiments or salt and pepper and such. And the fact that it's circular and it looks like it's on a circular kind of a stem.
Yeah, so not a separate table, but something sitting on that table with the with that weight, that curve, that you can see that line around which would be the edge of the table that the coffee cup is sitting on. And it looks like to me like maybe a crumpled napkin beneath the coffee cup. I can't quite tell what that is, but that's what it looks like it might be.
Doris, I was thinking maybe it's like possibly comment on the lack of food, the hunger. Maybe it's not real sugar. Maybe it's coffee, the chicory coffee. Maybe there's a comment on the quality of the stuff that's available.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because all we really see here are condiments. We don't really see any food at all. All we see, well, I don't see any food unless anybody else does, maybe trying to figure out what's going on in that background. But we can see coffee that may be ersatz coffee and a cigarette, but no food.
Right.
Interesting.
Condiments look to me like they're on a bistro table.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure how that, squares with the coffee cup position, which is on a table below it.
If you look, and I'm kind of going back to, I think it was Kathy who said it looked like a Lazy Susan or something on the table, and I hadn't thought about that until I looked at that partial table that you can see on the right, sort of in the upper third, and it looks like there's something on top of that table that might be like this. Does it look like that to you?
Yeah, possibly.
So that kind of makes me agree with Kathy. And someone else in the chat had observed, Gail, had observed that the perspective is very exaggerated, which is, probably gives, makes it kind of hard to determine what that really was. The figures in the vinegar bottle, Martha said, in the bottom of the vase remind her of Hieronymus Bosch, who does, again, those sort of surrealistic kind of artwork. So how does this make you feel when you look at it? What emotion does it evoke?
I'm not using any of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I want to have the vinegar that the guy's been swimming in there.
I think the whimsiness of it kind of evokes emotion of maybe escape from the here and now, and escaping into where it's maybe more positive for you.
Yeah, so that sense of that surreal, it gives you that sense of escape from the horrible things that may be going on in your life during that period. Someone says, Micah says playful. Ellen says confusion. Gail says, I'm not eating there. So that's sort of like what Barbara was saying earlier as well. Yeah. What about that flower? Does anybody know what that flower is?
I have no idea.
I'm not a gardener. It kind of looks like a weed to me. I mean, it doesn't look like something I would put on a table.
No, or a Venus flytrap or something like that. It's like reaching out, Little Shop of Horrors-ish.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of these tentacles reaching out to strangle you or grab you.
Right.
Yeah. Martha says, feels off kilter and uncertain, a reflection of the mood of the time. So similar to the earlier comment sort of, you know,
I wonder
escape.
what all the significance of the mushrooms are. There's a lot of mushrooms, like the top of the salt and pepper look like mushrooms to me, and mushrooms there. It looks like a lot of mushrooms.
Mushroom shapes, yeah.
Although
Anyone
the
have any
subject-
thoughts? Yeah. Kathy, I'm sorry.
Although the subject is, you know, coffee and a diner potentially with salt and pepper or whatever food, it's not very appetizing.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, again, kind of echoing that earlier comment that someone made about it. I don't think I want to eat there.
Yeah, it's cold.
Yeah, there's some more chats here. Lots of chats. If you think of it, Allegra says nothing works. You can't get anything out of the dispensers, which is true because there's all this stuff in the way if you tilt them over, and what they contain won't fit through the holes. So, yeah. And Christy's back.
The crumpled napkin in the front could be almost anything. I mean, a newspaper, a map, it could be, it's not really defined.
Yeah, kind of crumpled something. I couldn't figure out what it was, and I figured that, you know, because it looked to me like the coffee cup was almost empty, and, you know, the cigarette looked like it was kind of crushed out on the saucer there. I figured the person who was eating was probably done or totally lost their appetite after they saw what was in these condiment containers, and, you know, just crumpled up the napkin. But you're right, it could very well be a newspaper or some kind of paper. Could be a note that somebody, you know, wrote something on. It could be the artist depicting when he was doing this sketch, and this was a sketch that he didn't like, so he kind of crumpled it up and was going to do another one. Somebody liked the flower and says, this is Micah, love the flower, looks like a Victorian sketch. It does. Interesting.
The flower.
And it's, Gail says, take a look at this because I did not notice this. Now I will pay attention. Gail asks, are there figures or faces reflecting on the tabletop? Take a look at that tabletop. Sort of like looking at abstract art and saying, I think I see a horse. I'm not sure.
The texture is much more blended than the, you know, the linear drawing. It just looks a little softer to me.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It gives it that shiny shininess. Gail sees a face on the left. Christy, do you see a face?
Yes.
Can you?
And Gail, help me out here. Tell me if I'm, is it this area here?
Closer to the sugar bowl, Marie says. Oh, we're all seeing faces now.
See, I see it as a metal bistro table. So I just see it as a metal surface.
Yeah, as opposed to something on top of a table that we were suggested before.
The one behind it is wooden. I mean, you have wood. It appears to me that there is wood and then a tablecloth with the coffee, and then this bistro table in front of it. The perspective is so disjointed.
It is. It is. I see what you're saying about the wood. It does look like a wood grain, that sort of shaded figure outside of the line of that white, you know, that white curved line that we had said might be some kind of a tablecloth. Yeah.
Look at the relationship of the foot of the table on the right.
Yes.
And then the size of the table, which is not uncharacteristic of a bistro table.
Mm-hmm.
The pedestal and the base are usually smaller. The more you look at it, the more you see, the more interesting.
I know. I find that with a lot of prints. But this one in particular, the first time I saw it, it took me a few seconds to notice the figures. I didn't pick up on that right away. All the things in the bottles. I saw that one sort of drowning figure in the vinegar, but I didn't. It took me a few seconds to notice the other one. So there is a lot to look at. There was a comment about, it seems, Kathy says, it seems steeped in symbolism, but I'm not sure what it's symbolizing. I sort of had that same reaction, although we've heard some interpretations from some folks in this discussion, which I think is it's been really helpful to me, and kind of comparing it to what's going on during the Depression, no food, you know, just again, I think that's why it's so much more fun to look at art and talk about art with other people than just going into the museum and looking at it and trying to figure it out yourself. I think there's a lot of benefit to being together.
Then look at the scale of the chair in the upper left-hand corner.
In the upper left, is that what you're looking at? The chair in the upper left?
Compare, yeah. If you compare the scale of that, to the other objects.
Yeah, it does make everything seem a little out of kilter. The perspective is again kind of, I think for me, kind of contributes to that surreal sense of the whole thing.
It almost looks to me like that flower could be a microphone, like coming. That I get the sense it could be a microphone.
Like the spies. It does, you know, if you look at the upper part of the stem, I'm not being a biologist or knowing anything about plants, there's probably a technical name for that, but like the part that attaches to the actual blossom of that, it does look like a microphone. Yeah. Huh. So they're spying on us. That's what.
I didn't get the sense that the guy was drowning there. I thought he was diving for something.
Or diving, yeah.
As opposed to drowning in there.
Yeah.
You see his little hat floating on
under the water, or the whatever, under the vinegar. Yeah. Yeah, the artist is Fred Becker, and he was a pretty well-known printmaker. And this was done in 1937, so a little bit after the other two that we talked about. And he, I guess an interesting factoid, I always like to find these. His father was Fred Becker Sr., and he was a silent movie star in Hollywood. So Fred Becker Jr. was born in Oakland, California, and reared in Hollywood. And, but then, you know, did study art, moved to New York, and was you know, again an artist during the WPA, and he actually remained a part of that artist group until he was laid off in 1939, and that was pretty much right before the U.S. entry into the war. And so he did work in the war industry after his art job with WPA was over, and then eventually was drafted into the military. So just to, another comment from Edward before we move from this. If the symbols made sense in the day, but the meanings have been lost through time. Any thoughts on that? It's interesting. Yeah, so when you're talking earlier about, somebody was wondering that the mushrooms and the mushroom shapes might mean something, maybe they did at that particular time based on what was going on back in the 1930s. It was before, you know, before atomic energy, or I'd say it would maybe be mushroom clouds or something, but I don't know if that was, would have been known back then too.
Maybe it's a cheap source of food.
Yeah, that's true.
Growing in the woods or something.
Yeah, or maybe the fact that people were being kept in the dark about what's going on in Europe or something. So, I don't know, because you think of mushrooms growing in caves and stuff like that. Yeah. Very good. So just to kind of follow up, and I think you've done a little bit of this already when you were talking about the comparing and contrasting of these different ones. And just to conclude, just to say that FDR saw the arts and access to them as fundamental to American life and democracy. And he believed that arts fostered resilience and pride in American culture and history. And so I know we need to leave now, so we won't have time to discuss that, but I would just ask you to reflect on whether that is true of art today. And wouldn't it be interesting to have a WPA arts program today? So thank you all. Any concluding remarks from Christy?
Just to, as always, thank you. Doris is now been on the leader of programs twice when things have gone wonky. This was the second false alarm that we had today where we had to evacuate the building. And of course, it was the worst timing, but perfect timing because you had just moved to a new artwork. So I knew it would be okay for a little while. So thank you, as always, Doris, for your grace and ability to keep things rolling even when things are going kind of crazy over here. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. As always, it's been a really wonderful discussion. I have to say that even though I've seen these three prints so many times, you know, I always get so much out of these discussions and seeing things that I've never seen before. So thank you for your inquisitive eyes and the way that you're looking at things so deeply and making those connections. Next week, our moderator is going to be Hank Bovey, and he is going to feature 3 artworks that are in our collection, but also are featured in the special exhibition in the museum's atrium called Many Become One. So the topic and the 3 artworks are posted to the museum's website. If you'd like to get registered for next week's Slow Art Friday, please send me an email to get your name on the list. In the meantime, thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you to Doris. I look forward to seeing you soon. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.